And people might say, where? Where did we start seeing the Trinity in the Old Testament? You see it again in the very same chapter where it says, we. God refers to himself as we, plurally. How can God refer to himself plurally? And some people say, well, the Queen of England does that. The plural of majesty was not used in Hebrew at that time. It was not convention. And then also when God says, we will create man in our image, male and female, we will make man. Male and female, in his image, and then it goes to plurality once again. Multiple times plurality in the Godhead.
The last three examples are embarrassingly bad, and this is partly why I decided not to name names in this episode. If I made this dumb a mistake, I wouldn't want anybody to quote it. I would want them to let me know privately, but the people I've heard this from honestly ought to know better. But they will get up in front of evangelical groups and say that in Genesis 1,
let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness.
That is teaching that there's more than one person in God. This is a junky old argument, and it's just not defensible. If you look in any recent commentary, Jewish, Christian, Catholic, Protestant, it will say something like this. Yeah, people used to point at this verse and say that that's evidence of the Trinity or a hint of the Trinity or something. And in past times, others have said, no, this seems to be a plural of majesty. But now we think that they didn't use the plural of majesty in ancient Hebrew, so it's probably not that. It's not like the King of England in medieval times saying, let us decree a festival or something like that. Or even Allah in the Quran sometimes talks about we and us with reference to himself, just as a magnified royal way of speaking. The commentaries will say that scholars now think that they didn't use language like that in ancient Hebrew. What they do think it is that God is addressing the members of his divine council, the other divine beings, the other deities, the lesser deities. Just as in the human realm, a king or an emperor or a queen is attended by a court, so the assumption was in these times that God too is attended by a court not of humans, but of other spirits, of other, in some sense, divine beings. Of course, after God announces this to his court, he then proceeds to create humankind by himself. It uses a singular verb there. So no, there's no hint, there's no implication that the Trinity are making humankind, that God has to have a helper here in the form of the pre-existent Son. That's just not in the text.
And people might say, where? Where did we start seeing the Trinity in the Old Testament? I see it in the first verse of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, let's take that back into the Hebrew. It says, Elohim created. Elohim is the plural of God. It's gods. In the beginning, gods. But then the word created treats that word as if it's singular. In the beginning, gods created, as if it were singular. So right there at the very beginning of the Old Testament, you have plurality and singularity.
Another embarrassingly bad argument is pointing to the word Elohim and saying, see, that's teaching that there are multiple persons in God. No, no, no. Elohim is a strange word in Hebrew. It's grammatically plural, but can be singular or plural in meaning. And the way that you tell that it's singular or plural in meaning is by looking at the verbs and the adjectives that are put with it in a sentence. We have this type of thing in English. I've done a blog post about this before. If I go out and run around in the mud, I come inside, I'll say, these pants are dirty. And yet I'm only talking about one garment. If the football team goes out and plays a game in the mud, they come back into the locker room, take off their uniforms and give them to the guy that does the team's laundry, and he says, the pants are dirty. But in that context, he's referring to multiple garments, a whole team's worth. In English, notice we said these both times, and we said are both times. So we use the plural words to go along with it, and it just has a singular or plural meaning depending on the context, and we just figure it out. We don't have a lot of words like that in English, so it doesn't really cause confusion very often. But my understanding is that in Hebrew, if God or a single God is meant, they put it with singular verbs, in other words. And if gods is meant, if that's the meaning, plural, then they put it with plural verbs and other words. So, yeah, this is translated into English as God or gods, and it's usually just made clear by the surrounding grammar, or that plus the rest of the context. This doesn't teach multiple persons in God. It doesn't imply multiple persons in God. It doesn't even hint at multiple persons in God.
In the Shema, this is the statement that Jews would often recite twice a day. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Okay, very profound proclamation. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. In a world of polytheism, it's very profound. But that word one, Echad, is not used to describe a singularity. It's used to describe something like a cluster of grapes. You would refer to the entire cluster as one cluster. That's what the word echad is. So even in the Shema, we have shades of the Trinity.
And just as bad, or maybe worse, is the claim that the Hebrew word for one, echad, means a plural unity, or a plurality in unity, or a composite, or something like that. This is the word that appears in the famous Shema.
Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one.
Any person versed in Hebrew grammar will tell you, no, that word means one. It can be applied to things which have parts or which are in some sense plural. Sure, that's true in any language, and you could also apply this to a simple or partless thing. In English, you have one subatomic particle or one fundamental particle, but you also have one football team, one country, one human body, one earth, one solar system. You can count things which have an inner complexity, whether it's parts or different aspects or different properties, and you can count things that lack various sorts of inner complexity, whether it's different properties or parts or powers or aspects. It's just silly to say that there's something special about the word for one in Hebrew, that it means a composite one or a unity in plurality or something like that. It's shameful that this should occur in any big setting. If somebody says this in a megachurch, then somebody who's been to seminary and learned Hebrew should stand up and say, "Excuse me, that's not true." The Shema is not asserting that Yahweh is a unity of plurality or a plurality in unity, etc. It's just asserting the uniqueness of Yahweh. Why are people so careless as this? I think it's in part because a lot of apologetics is an in-house game. It's preaching to the choir. It's in a megachurch or an evangelical conference or an evangelical seminary. And there's just no fear of saying something stupid or of handing your opponents a stick to beat you with, which is exactly what you're doing with this type of linguistic sophistry. Any informed Jewish debater, Muslim debater, or Unitarian Christian debater is going to laugh at you and point out how uninformed you are if you say that the Hebrew word Elohim or Echad teach that God is multi-personal, or even that they imply it or suggest it or presuppose it or kind of sort of hint at it or gesture at it in some unclear way. Nope.